Reading in part, quote, "We were attacked on December 7th, 1941. We were attacked on September 11th, 2001. And we were attacked on November 8th, 2016. Dan Rather added this: Watergate is the biggest political scandal of my lifetime until maybe now. And finally this from Chuck Todd.
One of what is arguably the biggest presidential scandal involving a foreign government since Iran-Contra. Take a breath. Hyperbole aside, folks, hunker down, because this is a Class 5 political hurricane that's hitting Washington.
A Class 5 political hurricane. Ben Shapiro, editor-in-chief of thedailywire.com, and Richard Fowler, nationally syndicated radio host and Fox News contributor. Gentlemen, I hope you're hunkered down because this is big, big, big. Ben, what do you make of all that?
I mean, everybody sounds like a used car salesman trying to hawk an old Chevy. I mean, wow, it's the level of outrage over something that we don't even know what happened yet. I mean, I'm still confused as to what Flynn did that was supposed to be the worst thing that ever happened since the biblical plagues. And between Thomas Friedman, who apparently has the brain power of an overused hairdryer, and Dan Rather, the godfather of modern media fake news, talking about how this is the greatest crisis that we've ever seen in modern political history. Again, what happened? It's a very simple. Like, should we know what happened before we start to freak out and lose our minds?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, Richard. When you dig into the New York Times piece today, which, you know, started off declaring that there had been so much contact between the Trump campaign and Russia that it was just, you know, sort of, it's so dramatic in the nature of it that they just had to dig and dig. And then it said, but we dug and dug, and so far we haven't found anything at all in terms of a nefarious connection. They may, but we don't know that yet.
I mean, Martha, you're right. We don't know. We don't know that there is a crisis. I think the media is being a little rough on the Trumpster, but here's why. I think the reason why the media is being so rough on the Trumpster has everything to do with the fact that they've circled the wagon, that they haven't released any information. A little bit of advice for the Donald, if he's watching tonight, right? The first thing you do is you release these transcripts to the Intelligence Committee. They'll get it classified, get it over with so you could move on. He's going to need political capital to
I remember when that argument was used for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, and it's the right argument. Just get it all out there. Right? Because remember, he's going to need political capital to roll out his infrastructure package. He's going to need political capital to roll out his tax reforms. And right now, 90% of Republicans like him. But if this drip, drip, drip continues, Martha, it could create doom for the Trump administration just 30 days in, or 27 days in.
Put up these headlines that we have, because this story really broke a month ago. It was out there, you know, intercepted Russian communication, part of inquiry into Trump associates. And that story back then, and a Washington Post story back then as well, said that they didn't find anything nefarious. They didn't find any connection between these communications and the election. They just found, you know, that there was phone calls and there was contact that they were concerned about. We know Sally Yates brought that to the attention of the White House as well. And then I want to remind everyone of this moment with President Obama a while back. Watch this.
This is my last election. Yeah, and after my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah. Okay. I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir.
I understand. So after the election, we might be able to talk about that issue that's bothering you. Is that essentially what we think General Flynn may have said, Ben?
I think that's basically the idea, the only difference being that President Obama was in the middle of an election cycle, and Flynn apparently said a lot of these things after the election cycle was over. It was like 3 weeks before he was appointed NSA. You know, Richard, you're giving a lot of advice to Donald Trump, and I agree with a lot of the advice that you're suggesting for the Trump administration, but some advice for the media. Guys, if you want people to take you seriously, you have to stop setting your hair on fire and running into plate glass windows before you even know what the hell is going on. I mean, you are jumping on every rake in a 300-mile radius before you even let all the facts out. We can't take you seriously unless you lay out a series of facts that we can believe, instead of blowing up headline. Like the headline on that New York Times piece could easily have been, investigation shows no casual links between Trump campaign and Russians. But
I mean, the truth is, this investigation is an investigation that's ongoing. You know, when you step on a rake, it can hit you in the head.
Yeah.
So once you've laid down these markers that this is Watergate, this is Pearl Harbor, this is 9/11, you better be very careful what you put out there.
I think that has everything to do with, Martha, the fact that Donald Trump has sort of he's made the media enemy, right? You go out there in your press conference and say, well, yeah, Mike Flynn didn't resign, which really did happen. I didn't accept resignation, which really did happen, and say, I blame this all on fake news. What you begin to do is you put the media's best reaction is, well, listen, here's all the news, here's all the facts as they're being leaked out. And I think Donald should be more concerned about leakers in the White House and throughout the government than he should be concerned about the media and quote-unquote fake news.
We begin the day with the story of the day. And the story of the day is supposedly that Jeff Sessions is the most nefarious character that ever was. So the Attorney General for the Trump administration is supposedly this guy who is just awful, awful, awful. Why is he so awful? Because he met with the Ruskies. He met with the Ruskies, just like everybody else in the Trump administration. Apparently, he met with the evil, evil, evil Ruskies. And that means that he has to be stopped, right? I mean, the fact is that the Ruskies have been trying to get the Trump administration in their pocket, and now here comes Jeff Sessions trying to explain, trying to work the back room, basically. Here is the problem with all of that, okay? So there are a bunch of problems with this particular set of nonsense. I'll go through the entire story from the beginning because it's a little bit confusing. So here it is. He's the latest figure to come under heavy fire. Here's what you need to know. He testified back in January, I guess, that he hadn't met with the Russians when he was just a senator. He was not yet AG. And it was unclear whether he testified he hadn't met the Russians in his capacity as somebody on the Trump campaign or whether he hadn't met the Russians in his capacity at all. What he said, Al Franken asked Sessions what he would do if he learned of communications with the Russians from the Trump campaign, and Sessions said, I've been called a surrogate a time or two in that campaign. I did not have communications with the Russians. So is that a denial of any contact, or is it a denial of contact as a surrogate? Not really clear, because he could say, look, as a senator, yeah, I met with the Russian ambassador, but we didn't discuss the campaign, so it didn't have anything to do with Trump. Senator Pat Leahy asked Sessions in writing, quote, have you been in contact with anyone connected to any part of the Russian government about the 2016 election, either before or after Election Day? And Sessions said no. And Sessions issued a statement saying he did not meet with any Russian officials now to discuss issues of the campaign. So now he's changing his story a little bit. So this sort of back and forth has really hurt Sessions because it now turns out that Sessions met twice, that Sessions met with the Russians 2 times. So what does that mean? Did anything nefarious happen? No evidence that anything nefarious happened. He could have met with them to he's on the Armed Services Committee. He could have met with them to talk about that sort of stuff. Is it possible he talked with them about the campaign? Sure. But the problem is that now that he testified in front of Congress that he didn't, or at least he didn't in a certain capacity, and the language is a little bit vague, there are a lot of people calling for his recusal. There are a bunch of people in the Senate who have said that they don't routinely meet with the Russians. 20 lawmakers from the Armed Services Committee told the Washington Post they didn't meet with the Russian ambassador last year, but a bunch of senators have also said it's not out of the realm of possibility or out of the realm of normalcy for senators to meet with the Russian ambassador. Claire McCaskill, who has said that Sessions should resign for perjury, she said she's never met with the Russian ambassador, and then it turns out she met with him in 2013. So a lot of these senators have met with the Russian ambassador. This looks like a lot of smoke and no fire. It doesn't even look like real smoke. It's just like a bunch of crap, honestly. It looks like a smear job out to get Sessions the day after Donald Trump goes on his triumphant tour because he gave a good speech to the joint session of Congress. So all the Democrats are universally calling for his resignation, and this is where the Democrats are really, really stupid. So they don't have the capacity to just, in moderate fashion, say something obvious like maybe he should recuse himself. And that would be one thing. You could say, okay, look, whether he did something good or bad or not, it doesn't really matter. Now people are going to think no matter what he does, it's corrupt, so he should recuse himself. That's a fair argument. It's a fair argument. I don't think it's a great argument, but it's a fair argument. But instead, they're saying he should resign. So you have people like Nancy Pelosi saying, after lying under oath to Congress about his communications with the Russians, the Attorney General must resign. And then she was joined in that call by Elizabeth Warren, among others. Listen, Eric Holder, the Obama Attorney General, he didn't resign despite a scandal-plagued career ranging from Fast and Furious to overseeing journalists and attempting to prosecute journalists. He was actually held in contempt of Congress and he didn't resign. Loretta Lynch, as you recall, the Attorney General under President Obama after Holder, she refused to recuse herself from the investigation of Hillary Clinton. She said she wasn't going to interfere unless it went the way she didn't want, in which case she would interfere. So for Democrats to suddenly say that Sessions has to recuse himself based on he once met with the Russian ambassador is really over the top. But saying that he should resign is super duper duper over the top. Trump says it's a partisan hit job, and he's basically right. The White House Deputy Press Secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, she says this is the latest attack against the Trump administration by partisan Democrats. Attorney General Sessions met with the ambassador in an official capacity as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is entirely consistent with his testimony. It's no surprise Senator Al Franken is pushing this story immediately following President Trump's successful address to the nation. Here's my deal. Okay, folks, here's my deal. I am always going to call balls and strikes. I'm always going to call balls and strikes no matter who's at bat, because that's all that matters is the balls and the strikes, what is right and what is wrong, not the person at bat. If Trump's at bat, I'm going to call balls and strikes. If the Democrats are at bat, I'm going to call balls and strikes. Okay, so this one is a ball. I'm sorry, this is not a major story. There's no evidence that Sessions is deliberately lying about meeting with the Russian ambassador for some nefarious reason. Should he recuse himself is a second question. And that second question is basically, is he so compromised at this point that any investigation he does will be compromised? That's possible. That is possible. And there are good arguments both ways. On the one hand, there's that argument. On the other hand, there's the argument that if anybody can basically be prevented from doing their job by a media and a Democratic Party that insists that every minor problem is a major problem, then nothing's ever going to get done. If you're accusing yourself over, I once met the Russian ambassador at my office, then what won't you recuse yourself over? What can you actually do? That's a serious problem for the Trump administration. It looks, in all likelihood, like Sessions will just recuse himself on this thing. That doesn't mean there will be a special prosecutor, by the way. It just means that his deputy will end up prosecuting this thing. And his deputy, presumably, would probably act the same way that he would, because his deputy will be appointed in coordination with President Trump by him. So, the idea that he is going to somehow not be able to have control over the investigation is just not true. As an example, the Deputy Attorney General for Loretta Lynch was that lady who refused to prosecute Donald Trump's executive order and ended up being fired. So the Deputy Attorney General ends up looking a lot like the Attorney General under whom they serve. But here's my bottom line. This thing looks way overblown, even for people like me who are suspicious of Donald Trump's relations with the Russians, because there's a lot of smoke, but we haven't seen any real fire yet. Even for somebody like me who looks at Paul Manafort and says, that's kind of weird, and looks at Donald Trump constantly praising Putin and says, well, that's kind of weird, and looks at the fact that Michael Flynn was so warm with Vladimir Putin and said, that's kind of weird. Even for me, this is a nothing burger of a story. And again, balls and strikes are all that matters. I'm not going to rip Trump for doing something I don't think is particularly wrong. I'm Ben Shapiro. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.